and welcome to Flight TV, the only program about Russian general aviation. I'm Ignat Solovey, the cameraman and presenter. In this issue 20 we'll show you the return of the first Russian circumpolar flying boat expedition and tell you how did it go.
The idea of circumpolar flight arose in conversations between Air Volga CEO Sergei Alafinov and cosmonaut Valery Tokarev. Cosmonaut Tokarev told how spectacular Earth looks from space. Sports pilot Alafinov described the beauty of flying at low altitude. Afterwards, they decided to organize a circumnavigation flight together. It helped that Air Volga is the only Russian private airplane factory that manufactures planes capable of such a task. Valery Tokarev lobbied the idea in Russian Foreign Affairs, Russian Aviation Authority and Presidential Administration. Sergei Alafinov ventured into search of finance, crew members and resolved the issues of flying over polar Russia. Actually, it isn't really hard. You just need to solve a really tiny gazillion of problems, easy as it is. If you plan it for 5 years in advance, you'll make it. For a non-American, it is no problem to fly across North American continent via, say, Mexico. It is easy for anyone to fly around Europe. It is hard and sometimes impossible to fly in many African countries. Anyway, the world is open, and Russia too. But we're heading to northern Siberia and northeast of Russia, and there is no infrastructure in the northeast of Russia. Airfields are scarce and state-owned. They do not stock fuel we need. They are opened only on weekdays and only during daytime hours, which means no flights on Saturdays and Sundays. They are not expecting guests. It's only natural that during the preparations Air Volga company was busy not just with expedition. During those 5 years they designed and launched Borei, an ultralight amphibian two-seater. That plane turned out so fine and durable that it was decided to include it into the circumpolar venture, although initially that flight was for LA-8 only. There were training flights from Samara to Lake Baikal and to Pechora River. The most critical matters were financial, but they were solved as well. The project got Gazprom, VTB Insurance and Air Volga as principal sponsors. Additional support came from the Russian Federation of Amateur Aviators. The crews assembled at Krasny Yar airfield near Samara several days before the start. It would be good for them to train more and flight test engines on one of LA-8s after overhaul. Yet all that was messed by FIFA World Cup 2018 and ridiculous security measures surrounding it. All general aviation flights near 11 venue cities were prohibited, and Krasny Yar was in Samara no-fly zone. So crews had to test engines only on the ground, rolling around runway. Authorities were deaf and blind, even when it came to state-supported international circumnavigation flight. Not a whiff of security and safety here. We had no permission to flight test the airplane after engine overhaul, regardless of support from the Presidential Administration and Foreign Affairs. We're launching tomorrow, and the first half an hour of flight will be a test flight, en route. Moreover, we cannot turn back if anything goes wrong, because we have only one-way permit. We were literally told to fly the hell out of here. All that mess, though, was in the early July before the start. The expedition successfully covered about 24,000 kilometers without any incidents and safely returned home. They were welcomed back in traditional Russian way, with a special bread, homemade vodka, champagne and all requisite pomp and circumstance. 4 national and 5 regional TV channel crews, not to mention radio, wire services and newspaper reporters, and unprecedented media attention. It is safe to say that never before any Russian general aviation enterprise seen so many journalists at once, and never before such an event ever happened. It was the first flight around the world on Russian-made small airplanes with Russian crews. The flight itself went without any major incidents except treacherous weather at some locations. As the crew said, the 5-year-long preparation stage was the hardest. Everything had to be approved, prepared and calculated. It was like a space flight for me. After hatches locked, only I am responsible for everything, and thank heavens for that. Here it was the same. We took off and all that mess was behind us. We arrived to our first stop in Perm region, looked around, and then it all went according to our plans, mostly. Before, it was a turmoil, lots of things missing and astray. All 7 crew members came back sound and in upbeat mood, regardless that sometimes they had only 2 or 3 hours to sleep between the flight legs. That was seldom though. For the most time, they obeyed work and rest schedule. The flight was no rush. Pilots met locals, did some sightseeing and fishing, took a lot of pictures and videos. The pace was defined mostly by the speed of slow single-engine Borei. Borei is much slower than LA-8, so she either took off an hour or 2 earlier or arrived an hour or 2 later. The LA-8 sort of covered it. One took off half an hour earlier and the other one 30 minutes or an hour later. We tried to keep constant radio communications with Borei and helped her crew. The crew members noticed that in Alaska, Canada and Greenland, where there are no internet connection and even no hotels, and where they had to spend their nights in staff rooms or in tents outdoors, all the runways are impeccable, including radio-controlled runway lights. In Russia, no such luxuries. There are places where runways were deliberately ruined, specifically to prevent anyone from flying there. For example, in Dudinka. Regardless of such weird cases, Arctic is all the same, be it in Russia, USA, Canada or Greenland. The pilots never missed a chance to fish and to enjoy the nature, and noticed one peculiar thing. We noticed that environment becomes harsher when you go from west to east, be it in Russia or elsewhere. In Alaska, Canada and Greenland, it's all green in the west and barren stone and ice in the east. I don't know why Mother Nature decided like that. Another interesting thing was that the American part of the route was drawn along the NORAD station's line, since these places are the only airfields in polar Canada. For some reason, Russians, who are technically the citizens of potential foe state, had no trouble using strategic airfields and even taking pictures of NORAD radars. In Russia, getting close to anything related to air defense is prohibited, even if you are a Russian citizen with a special clearance and a borderline visitor permit. Almost everywhere in Polar America we were the first Russian citizens. Not ethnic Russians who you can meet anywhere in the world, but specifically citizens of the Russian Federation. Almost everywhere we were the first Russians to get to those places on their own Russian-made small private airplanes. People were amazed actually. There is no private aviation at all there because of unsuitable conditions. You cannot own an airplane where there is polar night for half a year. The circumnavigators seen almost no private aircraft along the way. Polar night, week-long snowstorms and -50 centigrade during winter are incompatible with any kind of general aviation. At many airfields where the expedition stopped, there are only 2 or 3 months of passable conditions in a year. Even during midsummer, the most favorable season there, the crew was grounded for many days 3 times, in Chukotka, eastern Canada and eastern Greenland. Delayed Chukotka was expected, but Canada and Greenland were nasty surprises. The scheduled return date was when all 3 planes were in Greenland. Some pilots ran out of their vacation time, yet, even in that case, flight safety was pivotal and all planes took off only when the weather allowed VFR flights. We are the team, so losing a part of the crew and fly away was not an option. That's why the risk assessment and deciding a team takeoff were the hardest. We argued a lot and some decisions were harder to make because, even being a team, we're different people with different views. Psychologically, the hardest decision to make was a leg between Greenland and Iceland. The team was literally saved by amazingly precise weather forecasts of Vladimir Grovkin, staff meteorologist of Baikonur Space Center. He provided very detailed weather data for low altitudes, while traditional METARs were useless. Another meteorman was Vladimir Shokin from Neftyugansk, who joined the back office later. When the planes took off from Greenland towards Iceland, they had to cross the ice dome at about 9,000 feet altitude and then drop down to 450 feet to catch tailwind and passed by icebergs that were 900 feet tall. They couldn't fly any higher because at 1800 feet there was strong headwind. Both meteorologists predicted that precisely, using complex combinations of various forecast models. We had to fly over the Greenland ice dome for 6 hours through unknown weather and unpredictable winds, and with headwinds the Bore had no chance to get to Iceland. We had only one 8-hour opening, but local forecast said nothing about the wind. If there were only LA-8s flying, they would make it in about 20 days at a leisurely pace, but testing the Bore in the harshest conditions was one of the expedition goals. The manufacturer needs to know the limitations, and the new machine passed the test perfectly. Valery Tokarev, who is not only a cosmonaut but a test pilot as well, noted that he had almost no questions regarding technical matters. Other pilots praised ease of control. That plane is very comfortable and not too fast. You fly and you know that you can land almost anywhere and anytime, and that landing will be safe. I think that seats need some improvement in terms of back support, but I guess that will be addressed anyway. Among the expedition conclusions were ideas on adapting the Bore for long-haul flights. For instance, this plane should be equipped with one two-person life raft rather than two single rafts. Regarding fuel consumption, practice showed that stock 90-liter fuel tank and an additional 50-liter allow 820 km flight with 10 meters per second headwind. At that, after each leg, the plane had about 30 to 40 liters of gas left, which would allow at least 90 minutes more flying time. Quite a number for an ultralight. I can give you an example of motorbike tourism. Of course, you can make a motorcycle that will carry you around the world, but it's really pointless. Motorcycle as a long-range vehicle is quite exotic. It is the same with the Bore. It is good for training, for fishing raids, for carrying cargo, but not for extremely long-range flight. In Alaska, Canada and Europe, locals were interested in Bore as a local transport, but type certificates are yet to be obtained. That will be easier considering recent changes in German regulations and upcoming similar changes in Canada. In Germany, ultralight seaplanes can now have maximum take-off weight of 650 kg. Canadian rules will change accordingly soon. New international LSA seaplane class is logical, considering that previous standards are 40 years old. People became bigger and requirements stricter. Loic Blaise, French seaplane pilot and the only non-Russian team member, thinks that the Bore has a great future.
You know, with Valery we had to take off with the Bore with very bad weather from Providenia and crossing the Bering Strait, and it was like both of us, like a lot of pressure. But well, Valery has cosmonaut balls, so it's not that much pressure for him. But this little plane was handling perfect.
Thank you for watching Flight TV. Please subscribe here on YouTube, follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. You see the links below. We also have a page on Patreon, and your support is very important to us. Stay tuned and fly safely!